In 43 years on this bench, I believed I had seen every version of human behavior a courtroom could produce. Defendants have spun wild stories in front of me, turned on fake tears like a faucet, and tried every legal trick in the book to dodge what they'd done. But not once in 4 decades wearing this robe had anyone raised a loaded gun at me. Until 9:47 a.m. on February 8, 2026, when Beverly Hills Police Chief Richard Vandermeer walked through my courtroom doors and made the worst decision of his entire life. You think you've heard wild courtroom stories before? Nothing compares to this one. Go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about power, authority, and what really happens when a person convinces themselves the rules don't apply to them. This case ended up making headlines in 73 countries. So let me take you back to where it all started. It began as an unremarkable Tuesday. My clerk handed me a file that looked routine at first glance. Case number 2026-TR8847, a traffic citation. The defendant, Richard Vandermeer, 52, Chief of Police for Beverly Hills, one of the wealthiest cities in Los Angeles County. The complainant, Officer Maria Santos, 34, an LAPD officer and single mother of 2 young girls, ages 6 and 8. Maria Santos was no ordinary officer. Before joining LAPD 7 years earlier, she'd served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan as military police, the kind of work that teaches you to stay level-headed when everything around you is falling apart. She came home with a commendation she rarely mentioned and a habit of checking every exit in a room before she sat down. Fellow soldiers remembered her as the one who volunteered for the convoys nobody else wanted to run. When she transitioned into civilian law enforcement, she picked night shifts on purpose, the ones her colleagues avoided, so she could be home during the day for her daughters. Her oldest, Emma, had been fighting leukemia for 2 years. Maria was drowning in medical bills, grabbing overtime whenever she could, and never once complained about it. She worked through her own bouts of illness rather than call in sick and lose the extra pay. Her co-workers said she'd give a stranger her last dollar without thinking twice, and more than one of them told me later that they'd never heard her raise her voice, not even under pressure that would break most people. She kept a photo of Emma taped inside her patrol car visor. Fellow officers said she'd glance at it before every shift. A small ritual to remind herself why she kept showing up night after night. On the night of January 22, 2026, around 11:34 p.m., Officer Santos was patrolling I-405 when her radar clocked a black Cadillac Escalade doing 97 in a 65. She hit her lights and pulled the vehicle over near the Sunset Boulevard exit. It didn't stop right away. It kept going for another 1.5 miles before finally pulling onto the shoulder. When Maria walked up to the window, she recognized the driver instantly. Richard Vandermeer, dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit worth more than her 2 months' salary combined, a Patek Philippe watch worth at least $80,000 on his wrist, sitting in an Escalade loaded with upgrades worth well over $95,000. She was polite, professional. She asked for his license and registration. That's when it went sideways. Vandermeer glanced at her badge, looked her dead in the eye, and told her she was a nobody from a nobody department who had no business pulling him over. He told her to get back in her car and pretend this never happened. Maria stayed calm. She told him she'd clocked him at 97 and needed his paperwork. He laughed in her face. Then he said something that still turns my stomach. He told her that her daughter's medical bills must be piling up, and it would be a real shame if she lost her job and her insurance over turning nothing into something. Let that sink in. A police chief threatened a sick child to get out of a speeding ticket. Maria stood there on the shoulder of a dark highway, cars roaring past at 70 miles an hour just a few feet away, and had to decide in that instant whether the man in front of her actually had the power to follow through on what he just said. She thought about Emma's next round of treatment. She thought about the insurance paperwork sitting on her kitchen table. And then she thought about every officer who ever looked the other way, because looking the other way was easier. Her hands were shaking, but she wrote the ticket anyway. Speeding, failure to yield to an emergency vehicle, reckless driving. Vandermeer grabbed it, tore it up in front of her, threw the pieces out the window onto the highway, and drove off without another word, tires kicking gravel onto her boots as he pulled away. Maria stepped out into traffic, retrieved every scrap of paper she could find off the asphalt, photographed the scene, documented it all in her report down to the minute, and turned it in the next morning before her shift even officially ended.
2 days later, her captain called her in. Someone in Beverly Hills had made calls. There was quiet pressure to make it disappear. But her captain, Robert Chin, 28 years on the job, wasn't the type to bend. He shut his office door, looked her in the eye, and told her that whoever was calling didn't outrank the truth. He told her to follow proper procedure and that he'd back her all the way, whatever came of it. Maria walked out of that office not knowing if her career would survive what was coming, only knowing she wasn't going to lie about what happened on that highway. That's how Chief Richard Vandermeer ended up in my courtroom. When he walked in at 9:45, 2 minutes early, the arrogance came off him like heat off summer pavement. Another expensive suit, Brioni this time, easily $6,000, plus $2,000 shoes. Beside him, his attorney Gregory Ashford, a Beverly Hills lawyer whose whole reputation was built on making rich clients' problems quietly vanish. Officer Santos sat in the gallery in her dress uniform, medals pinned precisely, her combat action badge, her Army Achievement Medal, her LAPD commendations. Back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. But I could see the exhaustion under it. The kind that builds from back-to-back shifts and nights spent beside a hospital bed praying your daughter makes it to morning. A few rows behind her sat Captain Chen, in plain clothes, there on his own time. He hadn't been asked to come, he just showed up, because that's the kind of man he was, and because he wasn't about to let one of his officers walk into that room alone. I called the case. Vandermeer's attorney stood, so did Vandermeer, but not the way most defendants stand in my courtroom. He stood like he was doing me a favor by showing up at all. I asked Officer Santos to testify. She walked up, laid out everything exactly as it happened. Calm, precise, thorough. Calibration records for the radar, dash cam footage, no gaps anywhere. When she got to the part about her daughter, her voice cracked, just for a second, before she steadied herself. After 43 years on this bench, I know what truth sounds like. She was telling every word of it. Then it was Vandermeer's turn. His lawyer tried to speak first, but Vandermeer waved him off like he was swatting a fly. He addressed me directly, claimed the radar must have malfunctioned, said he was barely over the limit, and suggested Officer Santos had misread her own equipment because she was distracted. He said all of it with a smirk on his face while a mother sat across the room thinking about her daughter's chemo. Something shifted after that. Are you still with me? Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my seat? Stayed calm? Thrown the book at him on the spot? Let me know, because what happens next will test everything you think you know about keeping your cool under pressure. I asked Vandermeer point blank whether he'd threatened Officer Santos's job and her daughter's insurance. He didn't hesitate. He admitted he may have mentioned that false accusations against a police chief could carry professional consequences. He said it as casually as talking about the weather, like threatening a mother over her dying child's medical care was just another Tuesday. I sat with that for a moment before responding, because I wanted the record to be unmistakably clear about what had just been said in my courtroom. I asked him to repeat it, slowly, so the court reporter could capture every word without ambiguity. He obliged, apparently believing repetition would somehow make the statement sound less damning the second time around. It didn't. If anything, hearing it twice made the room colder. His attorney went pale. Even he understood his client had just confessed to witness intimidation on the record, in open court, with no way to walk it back. I watched Gregory Ashford's pen freeze mid-note on his legal pad, as though some part of him was hoping that if he simply stopped writing, the last 30 seconds might undo themselves. But Vandermeer kept going. He said Officer Santos should be more careful about who she pulls over, that some people in law enforcement have bigger things to worry about than, quote, minor traffic stops. My jaw tightened. I've sat on this bench for over 4 decades. My father held this same seat before me, and he taught me early that everyone stands equal in front of the law. Rusted Honda or custom Escalade, mop or badge, doesn't matter.
One standard, no exceptions. I stayed composed and asked the court to play the dash cam footage. And that footage was worse than the written report ever could have conveyed. Every word, audible, his condescension, his threats. The moment he ripped up that ticket, you could see Maria's hands shaking while she held her professionalism together as this man mocked her and used her daughter's illness as a weapon. You could hear Vandermeer's laugh come through the courtroom speakers, tinny and cruel, followed by the sound of paper tearing, and then his own voice telling a mother of a sick child to remember her place. A woman in the gallery I didn't recognize actually gasped out loud. Captain Chen sat with his arms crossed, jaw set, staring straight at the man who tried to bury one of his best officers. When it ended, the courtroom was dead silent. Even his attorney looked shaken. Vandermeer just sat there, bored, checking his phone under the table like he had somewhere better to be. I asked if he had anything further to say. He stood again, and this time, something had changed. The condescension turned into something colder. He told the room he'd spent 27 years in law enforcement, that he ran a department for one of the wealthiest communities in California, that he golfed with 2 sitting state senators and had personal ties to the governor, that he dined with the mayor of LA twice a year. Then he looked me dead in the eye and crossed a line I didn't know existed in my courtroom. He said I was just a traffic court judge handling minor inconveniences and that I should be realistic about who I was dealing with. He said, word for word, that people at his level don't answer to people at my level. Dead silence. Officer Santos closed her eyes like she couldn't process what she'd just heard. My bailiffs, men I've worked with for years, tensed up. Everyone in that room knew something was coming. Nobody knew what. I took a breath, looked this man in the eye, a police chief who'd built his entire identity on the belief that he was untouchable. And I told him, in my courtroom, there are no levels. I told him a badge is supposed to mean something. Service, protection, integrity, not threats against single mothers, not using a title to intimidate people just trying to do their jobs. That's when something none of us expected happened. My clerk rushed up with an urgent note. I read it once, then again to make sure I understood it. The FBI had been quietly investigating Chief Vandermeer for 8 months. Case number FBI-2026-CR3342. Corruption, evidence tampering, systemic abuse of power, based on complaints from officers inside his own department. I later learned just how deep that investigation ran. It had started with an anonymous tip from a young patrol officer who noticed cash payments moving through a shell account tied to Vandermeer's department budget. From there, agents had spent months quietly interviewing business owners along Rodeo Drive who described being pressured into voluntary contributions in exchange for lighter enforcement. They'd subpoenaed financial records, tracked wire transfers through 3 different accounts, and built a paper trail that stretched back nearly 4 years. They'd already planned to arrest him within 2 weeks, timed carefully so as not to tip him off before every piece of evidence was locked down. Here's the twist. Agents were already on their way to my courtroom. They'd been monitoring developments in real time through a liaison in the district attorney's office. And based on what Vandermeer had just said on the record, combined with his documented threats against Officer Santos, they made the call to move immediately, rather than risk him fleeing or destroying evidence once he realized the traffic case had exposed him. The warrant was being executed right then, agents already en route with lights off, moving fast through downtown traffic. In 43 years, I had never had a federal arrest happen in real time inside my own courtroom. But I've never once let a teachable moment slip by unused. If you're still with me, you're about to see the moment that went viral around the world. But before we get there, if you believe nobody is above the law, no matter their title, their money, or their connections, hit that like button right now. Let's show everyone watching that accountability still means something. I told Vandermeer that before I ruled on his traffic case, new information had come before the court. He looked mildly annoyed, like someone whose time was being wasted. His attorney, on the other hand, looked like a man who could sense disaster coming, but couldn't tell from which direction. I told him the court had received word of pending federal charges and that agents were en route. His face changed instantly.
The arrogance dropped away, replaced by confusion, then fear, then something raw. He shot up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. He started shouting, actually shouting, in my courtroom, calling it a setup, insisting I had no authority to hold him. His attorney grabbed his arm. Vandermeer shoved him off and started for the exit, threatening anyone who got in his way. My head bailiff, Marcus Thompson, a former Marine, 15 years on the job, 6 feet 4 inches, planted himself in front of the door and calmly told Vandermeer he wasn't going anywhere. That's the moment Richard Vandermeer made the choice that destroyed the rest of his life. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his service weapon, a Glock 19, and pointed it directly at me. Time did something strange in that moment. Everything slowed down. Someone in the gallery screamed. Officer Santos shot to her feet. My bailiffs drew their weapons. Thompson had his sights on Vandermeer within 2 seconds. I didn't move. I sat there on the bench, staring down the barrel of that gun, and I did not flinch. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, but my hands stayed still and my voice stayed steady. I looked him in the eye and said one word, "Don't." For maybe 5 seconds, though it felt like time had stopped altogether, Vandermeer stood there, arms shaking, face somewhere between rage and panic, surrounded by my bailiffs shouting commands. "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground!" I saw his eyes flick toward the door, toward his attorney frozen in his seat, toward Officer Santos standing there watching him with an expression that wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to pity. I think that's what finally broke him, not the guns pointed back at him, the look on her face. Then his will just gave out. His arm fell. The gun hit the floor with a sound I'll never forget. Thompson moved faster than I've ever seen. Vandermeer was face down, cuffed, in under 10 seconds. I counted, 45 seconds total, from the moment he drew that gun to the moment he was in handcuffs. 45 seconds that felt like 45 years. 45 seconds that ended a career and proved without a shred of doubt that nobody is beyond accountability. The room fell into chaos, people crying, shouting, trying to process what they'd just watched happen live. Officer Santos had a hand pressed to her mouth, tears running down her face. My clerk was already on the phone. My bailiffs held Vandermeer down while backup arrived. And I just sat there, hands flat on my desk, focusing on breathing. I've had defendants scream at me, curse me out, threaten to find me outside. I had never had a gun pointed at my face. That mix of fear and fury and the sheer effort of not letting either one show, I'd never felt anything like it. Within 3 minutes, FBI agents came through the doors. Special Agent Patricia Moreno, lead on the Vandermeer case, took one look at the scene and took command. Vandermeer was read his rights on the federal charges already pending. Officer Thompson added the new ones on top. Assault on a judicial officer with a deadly weapon, brandishing a firearm in a courthouse, attempted intimidation of a judge. The list kept growing. Once they took him out, I called a 15-minute recess. I needed it. I sat in my chambers and just breathed. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting once the danger had passed. Someone had pointed a loaded gun at me in the one place that's supposed to represent safety and order. My clerk brought water. Thompson checked in on me, and Officer Santos stood outside my door. When I invited her in, she broke down completely, apologizing, saying this was all her fault, that if she'd just let it go, none of this would have happened. I stopped her right there. None of this was on her. She did her job. She did it right, professionally, and with real courage. She stood her ground against a man who'd spent his whole career watching people fold. She refused to trade her integrity even when it might have cost her everything. She's exactly the kind of officer every community needs. What happened next might genuinely surprise you, and honestly, it's the most important part of this whole story. But before I get there, I need you to do something for me. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's more to this story than the headlines ever covered. Outside, word had already spread. Someone in the gallery had recorded part of it on their phone before agents asked everyone to stop. And by the time I stepped back onto the bench, that clip was already circulating.
Reporters were setting up cameras on the courthouse steps. My clerk told me later that the phones in the clerk's office didn't stop ringing for the rest of the day. Local stations first, then national, then calls from overseas by that evening.
After I collected myself, I went back on the bench. Cameras were already gathering outside, but I still had a ruling to make. I called Officer Santos back to the stand and entered a guilty finding on every traffic charge: speeding, failure to yield, reckless driving, and added willful destruction of a citation, which I'd personally watched on the dash cam footage. But beyond the ruling, I wanted something on the record permanently. I said that Officer Maria Santos represented everything honorable about law enforcement. She served her country in a war zone, served her community without complaint, worked brutal hours to support her family while her daughter fought for her life. And when faced with corruption and intimidation from someone with far more power, she didn't bend. She chose right, even when it might have cost her everything. And I said Richard Vandermeer represented everything wrong with the abuse of power. He used his badge to dominate instead of protect, convinced himself his title, his connections, and his money put him above the rules everyone else has to follow. And what happened in that courtroom proved something I've believed my entire career. In the eyes of justice, there's no special category of person. No amount of money, no political friendship, no title puts anyone above accountability. The federal charges against him piled up fast: corruption, racketeering, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, abuse of power, and now assault on a judge with a deadly weapon. By the time it was all counted, he faced 37 separate federal charges on top of the state convictions. His trial started 6 months later. I followed it closely, sitting in the gallery on 2 occasions when my own docket allowed, curious to watch how a man who once told me he answered to no one carried himself once the roles reversed. He didn't carry himself well. Witness after witness took the stand against him. Patrol officers describing years of being pressured to look the other way in certain neighborhoods. A former department accountant walking the jury through spreadsheets full of unexplained cash deposits. Business owners along Rodeo Drive who spoke, some of them fighting back tears, about years of quiet extortion they'd been too afraid to report. Financial analysts traced the money across 3 states with a precision that left his defense almost nothing to argue with. And of course, there was the footage from my own courtroom, played for the jury in full, from 4 separate angles. A police chief pointing a loaded weapon at a sitting judge. Vandermeer took the stand in his own defense on the 4th day. It didn't go the way his attorney hoped. Under cross-examination, the same arrogance that had cost him everything in my courtroom resurfaced almost immediately. He grew combative with the prosecutor, dismissive toward the jury, and at one point suggested the entire case was the product of, quote, small-minded people who resent success. Several jurors later told reporters that was the moment they made up their minds. The jury took under 4 hours to come back guilty on every count. When the verdict was read, Vandermeer didn't react at all, just stared straight ahead, the same way he had that morning in my courtroom, except now there was nothing behind it, no arrogance left to hide behind. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison. He'll be 70 before he's even eligible for parole. His pension is gone. His certification is gone for good. The Beverly Hills house, the Escalade, the watches, all of it seized or sold off to help cover restitution to the people he'd extorted for years. He lost everything, piece by piece, in a process nearly as slow and methodical as the investigation that brought him down. And from what I understand, not one of the powerful friends he used to name drop in my courtroom ever showed up for a single day of that trial. Officer Maria Santos received a formal commendation for valor from LAPD and a civilian citation from the FBI for her cooperation. 6 months after the trial, she made sergeant, and I heard she was the first one to volunteer to train incoming officers on how to document an encounter properly. A small, quiet way of making sure nobody else in her position would ever have to wonder whether their word alone would be enough. The police union and several community groups raised over $200,000 to help with Emma's medical bills.
And Maria later told a local reporter that the outpouring of support from total strangers was the thing that finally made her cry after months of holding it together through everything else. Emma's doing well now, 8 months in remission, back in school, back on the soccer field, just being a kid again, no different from any of her classmates, except for the scar under her collarbone from the port they used for her treatments.
Maria and I have spoken a handful of times since that morning, briefly, the way people do when they've been through something together that words never quite capture. She told me once that she doesn't think of herself as brave. She said she was just doing her job, the same job she'd do 1,000 more times if she had to. I told her that's exactly what makes someone brave, doing the right thing when it would have been so much easier not to, and doing it without expecting anyone to notice. Her mother comes home from every shift now, knowing she made the right call, that she didn't let power and money rewrite what actually happened, and that her daughters are growing up watching what it looks like to hold your ground. I still think about that morning, about those 45 seconds where everything hung in the balance, about how differently it all could have gone. But I also think about what went right. A dedicated officer who did her job despite direct threats to her livelihood and her child. A court process that backed her up. Federal investigators who did patient, methodical work. And a system that responded exactly the way it was built to when a powerful man tried to shoot his way out of accountability. I still think about Officer Thompson, too. Standing in front of that door without a moment's hesitation, knowing full well what could happen to a man his size if things went wrong. I think about the courtroom clerk who kept her composure enough to get that note to me at exactly the right second. I think about every officer inside the Beverly Hills Police Department who quietly cooperated with federal investigators for months, knowing it could end their careers if word got back to Vandermeer first. None of them made headlines the way that gun on the floor did. But every single one of them made a choice that mattered just as much. Here's what 43 years on this bench has taught me. Justice doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't show up just because courts and laws and robes exist. Justice happens because people choose to make it happen. Officers like Maria Santos who refuse to be intimidated. Colleagues who testify against their own chief at real personal risk. Agents who spend 8 months building an airtight case. Bailiffs who put themselves between danger and the people they protect. It happens in small, unglamorous moments long before it ever reaches a headline. A decision to write the ticket instead of letting it go. A decision to file the report instead of burying it. A decision to keep investigating even when someone with power tells you to stop. Justice is a choice made over and over in every situation. You choose whether to hold people accountable regardless of their money and connections, or whether to give them a pass you'd never give anyone else. You won't likely be a judge or a federal agent, and you'll probably never end up in a courtroom standoff that makes international news. But you will run into moments where the easy choice and the right choice aren't the same thing. You'll meet people who think their status puts them above consequences. You'll witness something unfair and have to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet. When that moment comes, think about Maria Santos, exhausted, scared, stretched thin financially, staring down explicit threats against her sick daughter, and she still made the right call anyway. She didn't bend. She didn't trade her integrity for an easy way out. That's the real takeaway here. Not the arrest, not the verdict, not the sentencing. It's that ordinary people have extraordinary power the moment they stop believing that anyone is above the rules that hold everyone else together. If this story hit you the way it hit everyone who watched it happen live, hit subscribe, drop your thoughts below, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.
In the end, this case was never really about a speeding ticket. It was about what happens when power convinces someone that the rules no longer apply to them. Richard Vandermeer walked into that courtroom believing his badge, his money, and his connections made him untouchable. He walked out in handcuffs, facing consequences that would change the rest of his life. But the most important part of the story is Officer Maria Santos. She was exhausted, under financial pressure, and terrified of what standing up could mean for her family. Yet when she was given the choice between staying silent and doing what was right, she chose integrity. She wrote the ticket, documented what happened, and refused to let intimidation decide the truth. What happened afterward proved just how powerful that decision was. The investigation exposed a much larger pattern of corruption, and the man who once claimed that people at his level answered to no one was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. His badge, his career, his influence, and the connections he once relied on could not protect him from accountability. And that's the real lesson here. Justice doesn't happen simply because laws exist. It happens because ordinary people choose to stand up when doing the right thing is difficult. Maria Santos made that choice on a dark highway, and countless others made the same choice behind the scenes by refusing to stay silent. So remember this the next time you see someone using their position, money, or influence to intimidate others. No title makes a person bigger than the law. No badge makes someone above accountability. And no amount of power can erase the truth forever. If this story made you think about what justice and accountability really mean, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more powerful courtroom stories, real legal battles, and moments where justice takes an unexpected turn, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next case.